Well, Bolly Calera, agus to Firkin Fulch, Carmila Magia, soft of Firkin Fulch, Tarish, Romhain, agus Rhythm van Kayla Sivin. I'm very glad it's honor, agus pleasure them at the Loch Orman and you. So, aware Loch Orman is Corlori Mayor, members of the Oireachtas, councillors, distinguished guests, and above all else, splendid artists who have just performed. There is no more splendid use of your talent than to recover an important piece of history, that it is important that it be not lost. That it is important that it be not lost. May I say at the very beginning that I'd like to thank the Mayor of Wexford and Councillor David Hines for inviting me down here to come and inaugurate this, a public work of art, marking the centenary of the Wexfor Lock Out of 1912. A historic struggle that you've just heard secured a return to work for those involved and a vindication of the right of workers to establish a union to represent all foundry workers. And I think it's splendid that this very fine piece of sculpture will be there as a reminder of into the future, travelling from one generation to another, both of the importance of work with one's hands, that is the work of the foundry worker and the work of foundry workers in the past, but also of a great struggle for the right and defence of work. And I know that Wexford Borough Council and its Centenary Committee had been working hard to commemorate the strength of the workers, their families and the community, and the origins of foundry work in Wexford. I should say that it was very interesting as a youngster, I remember, in County Clare, in the fields before people abandoned intensive agriculture of any kind. You would see pieces of equipment with the word Pierce written on the side of the ploughs, written on the sides of harrows and on the sides of seed distributors and so on. So in a curious way, the events that you've just heard reenacted were ones that were quite extraordinary. The land had been inherited by people through the different land acts, and particularly through the 1906 Land Act, which transferred a great deal of land to landholders for the first time. Decades earlier, the agricultural workers carried the greatest brunt of the famine and the greatest brunt of the post-famine migrations. And at that particular time, the agricultural labourers would find the greatest difficulty in achieving not just recognition of their union, but decent conditions of work. And in the foundries that made the equipment that would go in time to all of the graziers and to the different people who took land from them, standing behind it was the labour of the workers in Wexford. And I think when your committee was looking at it, a very good friend of mine, the late Michael Enright, had written Men of Iron, Wexford Foundry Disputes, 1890 to 1911. And I know that booklet was published by the Wexford Council of Trade Unions, and the Wexford Historical Society has to be commended for republishing Michael's monograph. May I say a word about this, because it is a matter of some comment that arises regularly as we head into a period of commemorations. There will be many, and I as President will be speaking at different ones. And there is indeed a committee of government to look at how we might be sensitive and appropriate in celebrating commemorations, and I very much subscribe to that. The one thing we cannot do is to affect some kind of amnesia and leave people written out of history as if events never took place. Rather, what we have to do is we have to be able to go back and realize that there are different narratives of different times, particularly in relation to the division unification of this country. Place them side by side with respect, be open to revision where new facts and new material is available, and then after that put ourselves in the place of the other, and then in time move on. and so. But what we cannot do, and nor should we do, is ever forget the extraordinary courage of those who all that they had was their labour and their work, and who wanted to combine together to express that in solidarity. And that is what is happening today. I think that it is very interesting that reference has been made to labour history, and the Labour History Society has worked very hard, but it is not just an academic and intellectual discipline. It is one that really is something that, for example, sits side by side with the struggle of workers in the United States, the workers in different parts of South Africa in different conditions. It's part of global history. And one of the most interesting things about the Irish period, and I will be speaking about it between now as we see this as a great and splendid rehearsal for 1913, something that drew the attention of writers and intellectuals outside of Ireland, such as George Bernard Shaw and others, but also very importantly involved families. It set up something interesting, a choice that sometimes proved unfortunate, which was that you had to choose sometimes between your class, your nation, a version of home rule, or your religion. And these great projects were sometimes used to divide people whose common interest would have been served by a society built on justice. This is Peter Hodnett's work. And is there anything more appropriate than somebody who worked for over 30 years in the engineering industry could make this piece that will be there, and it's an enduring tribute to him, his life, and the kind of work he represents. I think that let's give him a round of applause. There's something very symbolic in its own way even about this. It is that a person who is in fact, and you saw images in different times of people beating on the anvil and so forth. You can do something that is useful and functional in a forge, but you can also think about making something beautiful. And it is after his 30 years' work that Peter, in his own way, set out to follow his passion for art and sculpture. And as the minister in my day in the past who introduced the 1% scheme for public art, I can think of no more splendid example. I think it reflects not just his own background as a factory worker in steel, but as a Wexford man, and as an artist, and as a trade unionist, framing an iron gate at the entrance to a foundry, one that is chained shut, reflecting, as I said, the infamous lockout in the town's 3 foundries. I think the events in this town 100 years ago marked a significant development in the rise of a whole new era in the history of modern trade unions, the struggle to extend union organization for the very first time to the mass of unskilled workers. These workers were refused the most basic rights, including the very right to organize. Working conditions were often very poor and wages were extremely low. Of the thousands of manual workers in Ireland, many worked a 70-hour week for as little as 70p. And you know, when I was listening to these great speeches, so well delivered, I pay tribute to you all, I thought of the case being made for the one big union as well. When I came back from Britain and came back from Manchester University in 1969, I joined the union myself. I founded the teaching section of the Workers' Union of Ireland. And we founded that union because so that the ground staff would be in it, and the laboratory technicians. And also, then eventually there was, of course, the Irish Federation of University Teachers that was being organised by Carter Asman at the time. So we set off on a tour of the country, and I ended up with everyone below associate professor, and he ended up with everyone from associate professor up. But the whole fact of the matter was, so that when issues came up, that we saw them as collective issues, and this collective power is still important. And all over the world on a day like today, we should realize that it is one of the most fundamental breaches of rights to refuse the right to join the union. and Wexford's industrialised character. Locked as it was away there, these machines were made, pieces of equipment, moved out of Wexford, and they were used by people who sometimes were putting the new property before issues of family or issues of solidarity with workers. And that was the problem, the division of people with a common experience of working. I think Wexford is also unique. It's a splendid town, but the reason I suppose it had the tree factory was that there was a seafaring and trading link with Bristol. The foundry industry had become well established by the end of the 19th century. There are many objects, beautiful objects made that we know that have come out of that period. And the three foundries, Pearce's foundry in Mill Road, the Selsker Iron Works and the Star Foundry, as I said, really provided most of the agricultural machinery needs of what was a tillage county, but also, of course, supported a thriving export trade to world markets. The traditional exclusivity of the earlier organisations of skilled artisans had begun to give way to a more generous recognition of the essential solidarity of all wage earners. I said when I came back from Manchester in 1969, the very first research project I had was a work on Galway docks and representing the dockers section. It was the time, I think, really, when the Transport Union, as he was then secretary, would almost, in fact, go to bed early for a fortnight to get ready for the annual general meeting of what was then called the Dockers section. And really, Gilbert Lynch, who is my predecessor as a representative, there was a big, as Labour TD for Galway, had that particular charge as well of representing the Dockers section. A branch of the National Dock Union of Dock Labour had been set up on Wexford docks nearly 20 years, more than 20 years before the lockout, in 1890. Just think of it, how advanced they were. It was only 1 year after the union had been established in Great Britain. And in June 1911, just 1 year before the lockout we are celebrating here now, the dock workers became the first members of the Irish Transport and Generals Workers Union in Wexford, and after that the iron workers in the foundries were joining that union. The foundry dispute stemmed from the dismissal of a known union member by Pearce's foundry in August 1911, as you heard, and it would continue until the following February. The recourse to a lockout on the part of the foundry owners was a preemptive blow aimed at ensuring that the newly emergent Irish Transport and General Workers Union would not get itself established in the industry in Wexford. Rather like the phrase, we don't want that kind of thing here. We are all one, friendly, family, so on. The result was that over 700 men were thrown out of their employment, and indeed, as you have just heard, in the course of the conflict that followed, Michael Leary, an innocent bystander,